Hello everyone, it's Saturday, September the 5th, the year 2015, and a friend of mine recommended a book, and I just finished reading it. It's called The Real Lincoln. It's about Abraham Lincoln. So the title is The Real Lincoln, A New Look at Abraham Lincoln, His Agenda, and an Unnecessary War, and the author is Thomas DiLorenzo. And I found it just an absolutely amazing book, and as I get older and just learn new things, I don't even want to say wiser, because it's like the more I learn, the more stupid and brainwashed I feel like I've been my whole life. But the pieces are starting to come together about how really corrupted this world is. And my whole life I was been taught that Abraham Lincoln was a good historical figure. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but Lincoln was an absolute piece of human garbage, a tyrant of the worst sort, who fought for centralization of government power. He fought for a national bank. He actually attacked Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson was one of the good presidents who fought a nationalized bank, a central bank. And Lincoln argued that we should have a centralized bank and centralized powers. And it's just amazing to me, the more I learn as I get older and older, about how brainwashed we've all been about our history. And I wanted to cover some of the aspects of this book and just give some highlights, but I do recommend you buy the book and take the time to read it if you want to get a different understanding of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. I think it's just absolutely amazing, the history that we've been told. And I've been to Gettysburg, and I saw little black children wear the Lincoln top hats, and the stories that were told about how the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, which is absolutely not true. And I've been told various sides, and I didn't really take a strong side one or the other until I read this book, because I just didn't really have strong feelings about it. I was like, I didn't know, right? But now that I've read this book, a lot of pieces fall into place, and a lot of things start to make sense. And it's just yet another example of good versus evil, and centralized power to control the little people versus the right of succession, the right of the states to govern their own territory and their own lands. And the right of succession has always been a part of the American experience and the landscape. And I really truly believe that, after reading this book, that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and that Abraham Lincoln was an absolute tyrant of the worst sort and responsible for the deaths of hundreds, thousands of men in that Civil War, and it was completely unnecessary. And anyway, I took some notes while I read the book, and I want to read you some excerpts from it. It's funny, because you get people the book even mentions magazines like WorldNet Daily and contributors to WorldNet Daily like Alan Keyes. And I think Alan Keyes and Pastor Manning, to some extent, believe that the Civil War was fought over slavery, and I've heard Pastor Manning make that argument. And this is yet another topic that I've got to disagree with him on, and I guess I would disagree with Alan Keyes as well, based on what I read that he wrote by WorldNet Daily. But it's just very obvious to me, given people's worldview, and a lot of it boils down to your worldview and how you view the world, and what you think is critical, and what you think is important to good, and what you think is important, how you see the fight of good versus evil, right? And it's just Satan versus God, right? And Satan wants centralized, authoritative, tyrannical power so that he can, push his satanic agenda upon the people. And he needs a centralized bank. He needs centralized powers in order to accomplish the evil agenda. But and that's what Lincoln was fighting for, was the centralized power. But I wrote down in my notes racial equality, and I wrote down page 8. Let me run to page 8 and see why I wrote that. Here's an excerpt from the book. Chapter 10 explains how the death of federalism, the decentralized system of government that was established by the Founding Fathers, was perhaps the biggest cost of Lincoln's War. Although Lincoln is generally credited with having saved the Union, in reality he destroyed the idea of the Union as a voluntary association of states by forcing the Southern states to remain in the Union at gunpoint. Lincoln can be said to have saved the Union only in a geographical sense. It was not to end slavery that Lincoln initiated an invasion of the South. He stated over and over again that his main purpose was to save the Union, which is another way of saying that he wanted to abolish states' rights once and for all. He could have ended slavery just as dozens of other countries in the world did during the first 60 years of the 19th century, through compensated emancipation, but he never seriously attempted to do so. A war was not necessary to free the slaves, but it was necessary to destroy the most significant check on the powers of the central government, the right of secession. You know, you would be an absolute idiot to sign up for something that you couldn't get out of, and the states always had the right of secession. It was just a part of the American landscape of that time, and I hope that it is again. Matter of fact, I hope that Texas succeeds as soon as possible if it was up to me. But there's just so many things this book covers. It's just an amazing, amazing perspective into history. But Lincoln himself was not for racial equality, and when they lift him up, they have that Zeus-like statue, I think, in Washington, D.C., where you walk up and Lincoln's sitting in his, I guess it's carved out of marble and he's bigger than life. It's just absolute heresy. Right? He's a murderer, a war criminal, a tyrant. I don't consider him, the worst words I could possibly bring out to describe that evil man, Abraham Lincoln. And the South absolutely had the right to secede, and it's just terrible. Now that it's just, you view the American government, and it's just, my goodness, it's just, it's so evil. Our American government has a history of evilness, and everything is slanted, and everything has been perverted when you watch the movies and when you listen to mainstream history. That part about peaceful emancipation, I think I wrote some notes on page 50, but there were lots of countries like Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Central America, Mexico, Bolivia, Uruguay, the French and Danish colonies, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela, that all got rid of slavery without having to have a civil war, right? What Lincoln did is he used the topic of slavery, and he used the topic of racial equality, and you can tell by Lincoln's own words that he was not for racial equality. He was a white supremacist. But the blacks, like, the so-called progressive blacks, like even Alan Keyes, and I love Pastor Manning, don't get me wrong, but he lifts up Abraham Lincoln as someone to be revered, at least in the comments that I've heard him say. And the more I learn about Abraham Lincoln, he was an absolute tyrant. He was a white supremacist. And he was not for racial equality. But the history that we've been taught makes everybody put their black top hat on and call him Honest Abe and act like he, produced this Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves. And this book enlightens you a great deal on that Emancipation Proclamation and what a joke it was. I want to read to you some things about that as well. But one of the main points of this book is that we didn't need a civil war to free the slaves, and that the Civil War, it was done under the guise of freeing the slaves to manipulate people's impressions and to gain support from Europe, who they needed European support in order to win the war, and I think the South and the North were vying for European support. but that whole slavery thing was nothing but a crock and a load and propaganda to gain support. But that Emancipation Proclamation was like a propaganda effort.
Could it possibly be to change the subject from secession?
Exactly. The subject was always about states' rights and consolidation of government power, and that's what the South was fighting. But they used the topic of slavery to change the topic. You've heard the executive orders, right? And how Barack Obama abuses executive orders. Let me read to you page 37 from this book. Page 37 says, "Today, of course, presidents routinely dictate thousands of laws and regulations and executive orders that state and local government must comply with. It was Lincoln who let the genie out of the bottle with regard to the transformation of the states into mere subsidiaries of the federal government." Lincoln tore apart the Constitution. He absolutely trampled the Constitution in ways that would make Barack Obama look like a kindergartner. He disarmed the border states. He took people's guns away. He gave dictator edicts as president that were totally unconstitutional. And it's just, you got to read the book to understand the details and what his main focus was. But it was absolutely for a nationalized bank and for centralization of government power. Which, let me read to you about the banking centralization that Lincoln argued for. And many times Lincoln would actually attack Andrew Jackson, but I think I mentioned that before, but let me go back to page 68. Page 68 says, "From the time he entered politics, Lincoln was devoted to the American system." But you got to understand what type of American system and what he means by that phrase, American system. During the national election campaign of 1840, he made numerous speeches in favor of establishing a nationalized banking system. In a speech on banking policy delivered December 26, 1839, in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln attacked Andrew Jackson and defended the alleged constitutionality of a national bank. What is Lincoln on, the $5 bill? I think it is. Andrew Jackson was an absolute great president from the perspective of that he fought the national bank. And Lincoln was the opposite of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson tried to stop a national bank and successfully did so, and Lincoln tried to undo and argue against everything that Andrew Jackson did. Let me read you this. There was a point where, as a leading member of the Illinois legislature, Lincoln repeatedly opposed proposals by Democratic legislatures to audit the Illinois State Bank. So just like have Ron Paul today, and he's like, audit the Fed, audit the Fed. Well, that stuff was going back on in Lincoln's time, and they wanted to audit the bank, right? But Lincoln wanted desperately to avoid this move toward sounder, gold-based money. So in an attempt to stop the adjournment of the legislature to audit the bank, right? So he's like, you got the Ron Paul folks up saying, I want to audit the bank, Lincoln and his fellow Whigs headed for the door, which was locked and guarded. Their objective was to leave the room so that there would be no quorum to vote for adjournment. Blocked from the door, Lincoln jumped out of the first-story window and was followed by his Whig compatriots. After this event, the Democrats began referring to Lincoln and his flying brethren. So rather than, make a move towards sounder-based money with gold-based money, you got to understand how evil money is too. And so all the pieces have to fit together in your mind for and I don't know how to articulate this extremely well, but the most evil institution in the whole world by far is the Federal Reserve, and the fact that you have these so-called Jewish controllers who control the money, and therefore mankind's labor is controlled by the owners of the Federal Reserve, and they have this incredible amount of power, right, to manipulate human behavior that they would not have if they did not own the Federal Reserve and own mankind's money supply. And when you're arguing that you should have centralized banking, you're basically arguing for Satan himself, right? And so your intensity and knowledge of that issue, right, a centralized banking issue, and your intensity, whether you like it or whether you intensely hate it, puts everything else into perspective when you read what Lincoln's position was on banking. An analogy I would give is when you read Martin Luther's book, he wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies. I'm getting off topic here a little bit. But if you have an intense love for Jesus Christ, right, and if somebody mocks Jesus Christ or says something ridiculing about Jesus Christ, then you'll understand like Martin Luther's attitude when he wrote that book, The Jews and Their Lies, right? Because if you have an intense love and respect and admiration for Jesus Christ, right, as Lord and Savior, that he's God Almighty in the flesh, then some of the things that Martin Luther says in that book make sense to you on why he would say those things because of the Jews' position about Jesus Christ. Now, the same analogy I would apply to this book about Lincoln. If you don't have that understanding about how evil a Federal Reserve centralized banking system is, then my hatred for Lincoln won't make any sense to you, right? Because you have to it's like the pieces have to fit in order, right? You have to understand how evil a centralized Federal Reserve is to understand my position on Lincoln, because Lincoln's position was for a centralized bank, and he needed the states to fall in line. And since the states weren't falling in line, and thank God for South Carolina and they're firing upon Fort Sumter, you know, that was a great thing that South Carolina did, and praise God for the Dixie flag. But let's go on to some other topics I want to cover in this book report about the real Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation, you know, and I've heard so-called educated black men talk about how great the Emancipation Proclamation was and it freed the slaves. Nothing could be furthest from the truth. I want to read you guys a paragraph about that. It was just nothing but a propaganda to help win the war. Let me start here. The Emancipation Proclamation, this is page 36. The Emancipation Proclamation was immediately excoriated throughout the North and much of the world as a political gimmick. The New York World newspaper sarcastically editorialized that the President has purposely made the proclamation inoperative in all places where we have gained a military footing which makes the slaves accessible. He has proclaimed emancipation only where he has notoriously no power to execute it. The exemption of the accessible parts of Louisiana, Tennessee, and Virginia renders the proclamation not merely futile, but ridiculous. As to the proclamation's practical effort, wrote the World, it has none. The freedom declared by this proclamation is dormant, not an actual freedom. Lincoln's own Secretary of State, William Seward, mocked the Emancipation Proclamation by saying, we show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them and holding them in bondage where we can set them free. Do you understand what it's saying? The North had military advantage over certain sections of the country. And the Emancipation Proclamation, if it really truly was written by Lincoln to free the slaves, would have freed the slaves in the Northern Territory where they had a military advantage. But it didn't do that, right? What a hypocrite, right? They only freed the slaves in the Southern territories where they had no military advantage. It's like when you're at war with your enemy and you wrote on a piece of paper, I free the slaves in my enemy's territory, but in my own territory where I have the advantage, I'm not going to free any freaking slaves. You see what a hypocrite that is? And we build a Zeus-like statue to this man, and they make movies about him and act like he's some great president of the United States. You've got to be kidding me. This book also talks about the rules of war and Emmer Devitel, which is kind of amazing because you guys know that I've talked about Emmer Devitel quite a bit and his book, The Law of Nations. Page 174 mentions that book, The Law of Nations. And it doesn't say anything about Natural Born Citizen, which is I often refer to that book because of that. But it also talks about the Law of Nations because the North and the South were supposed to get their rules of war from Emmer Devitel's book. But it talks about the march of Sherman and I think Sheridan and how they just had a scorched earth policy and they raped Southern women. And they went into these what they call the plantation abodes, and they went into like houses of Southerners, and they just burned them to the ground. They burned entire cities, right? And there's documentation of this in many diaries that were kept by the Southerners, that, you know, the Northerners would come through and just burn the entire towns, and it's very well documented. And you know, I guess that's why I still can't stand Northerners today for the most part. Anytime I meet a Northerner, I was like, I just naturally don't like him. And I think it just, you know, I'm a fourth generation Texan. My son is a fifth generation Texan. But I guess it comes naturally. I'm not saying that means anything because it's, you know, who gives a crap about pedigree. But I'm just saying a Southern man just has a natural dislike for the Northern man. They're uppity and arrogant, and I think the wrong side won that war. But if you read page 174, it does talk about Emmer Devitel's Law of Nations, and it talks about how the North, and Lincoln was absolutely aware of it. A lot of historians they try to cover up for Lincoln on what was being done with the raping and the pillaging of the southern towns. And they talked about how it was considered the Geneva Rules of Convention, or I forget how to say it exactly, but the Geneva Rules of War, where you did not attack like citizens, right? But that's not the attitude of the North. They absolutely obliterated entire cities, and they did not abide by rules of war whatsoever. Matter of fact, let me read to you page 183, which I think is something that Sherman wrote. And Sherman, I think, was one of the Northern commanders. It's absolutely amazing, his attitude about how he approached the South. Okay, here's page 182. Upon taking command in Memphis, Sherman described his ultimate purpose in the war to his wife. So this is Sherman talking to his wife, right? Extermination, not of soldiers alone, that is the least part of the trouble, but the people. His loving wife responded by expressing her sincerest wish that the war be a war of extermination, and that all Southerners would be driven like the swine into the sea. May we carry fire and sword into their states, till not one habitation is left standing. Sherman and his family, explains Sherman biographer John Marzalek, saw everyone south of the Mason-Dixon line as an implacable enemy. That's the kind of men that Lincoln put in command of the Northern armies. And I hope you guys caught that sentence I just read. His expressing her sincerest wish that the war would be a war of extermination, and that all Southerners would be driven like the swine into the sea. Oh my goodness. So this is quite a book. I definitely recommend you read it. Another thing that you may be surprised to hear me say, because you hear a lot of praise for the Southerners about Robert E. Lee, and they talk about Robert E. Lee in the South as if he's some sort of hero, right? And you know, I think the Dukes of Hazzard car with it, or is that General Lee? Robert E. Lee. They talk about Robert E. Lee as if he's some sort of great general of the South, and I tell you what, if General Robert E. Lee, I wouldn't walk across the street to shake his hand. I consider him a traitor. It's just like, you know, I made a video earlier I think it's this year or last year, saying that I think Ron Paul should be beheaded. A lot of people in the South love Ron Paul. They think he's a great, you know, leader because he wants to audit the Fed and return us to sound money. But there was a little video where Ron Paul is asked about, Obama's birth certificate being a forgery and asked about him not being a natural-born citizen. And Ron Paul's response was, on video, "I don't think it's important. I'm not even asking any questions." And for that, even though he's got a lifetime of great service to America, I'm talking about Ron Paul, right? I think that if I know it will never happen, right? But if it was to happen, and God was to put me in any sort of authority in this world, I would start with the beheading of Ron Paul to set the tone of how the rest of humanity should be treated. Because Ron Paul doesn't think it's important that the commander-in-chief of the United States military, that it's important that we should ask any questions about whether he's eligible to be commander-in-chief and president of the United States. And
After he's convicted?
yeah, he should be beheaded once he's convicted in a court of law. And that's what I think about Ron Paul. Now, the same analogy I'm going to say about Robert E. Lee, because a lot of Southerners feel a lot of love and regard for Robert E. Lee. But I'm going to read you guys a paragraph about. You say, why are you saying this about Robert E. Lee? What makes you've told us why you dislike Ron Paul so much, because he claims to be a defender of the Constitution, right? Ron Paul does. But when it comes to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5 about natural-born citizen, he doesn't want to defend that part of the Constitution, right? It's not politically expedient not popular for Ron Paul to defend that part, right? So that's why I can't stand Ron Paul. It's just like the Bible, right? People they love parts of the Bible, right? But when there's particular verses they don't like, I don't want to defend that part of the Bible, right? It's the same thing with the Constitution and Ron Paul. But what did Robert Lee do that pissed me off so bad, right? Robert Lee went against the request of Jefferson Davis, and Robert Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. And that was against the orders of Jefferson Davis, right? And you say, well, Rudy, you've never seen war, you've never seen tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dead men on the battlefield. Maybe you don't know what Robert E. Lee experienced, and you can't really blame the man for surrendering because he just wanted to put an end to the killing. Okay, that's true, right? And I got to say, I haven't seen that sort of death that Robert E. Lee has seen, right? And I'm sure that he's seen quite a bit of death and destruction in his life. And I will grant you, I don't have that experience that he's had. But what I will say is that in my current frame of mind and in my current journey through this universe, this thing called life that God puts us through, I can't ever imagine that it's the appropriate thing to do to surrender to tyranny, right? And that it would have been better for him to take whatever men he had and just fight to the death, right? And every last Southerner, just fight to the death and never ever surrender to these evil bastards, right? That's what I think Robert E. Lee should have done. And you say, well, that's very extreme, and you're obviously a crackpot. Well, let me read to you on page 201 what Robert E. Lee said about his own surrender. Okay, do you believe a man when he talks about his own experience? Okay, I'm gonna read to you what Robert E. Lee said. Page 201 of this book. There was certainly a lasting peace, but few Southerners would have characterized it as just. Shortly before his death in 1870, General Robert E. Lee told former Texas Governor Fletcher Stockdale that, in light of how the Republican Party was treating the people of the South, they subjugated the South. They made the South like, you got to read the book, but it's like it was not conditions that you would ever want to live in. You might as well just want to die. There's a movie called The Outlaw Josie Wales. I suggest you watch that movie. It also talks about, oh my goodness, there was a band of outlaws. Outlaw, do you remember?
Quantrill?
Yeah, Quantrill's Raiders. There's a movie. There's a scene in the movie where an old lady comes out and there's a ferry boat going across a river. And she mentions to Outlaw Josie Wales, Quantrill came through here just a few weeks ago. It's very short, and if you don't pick up on it, you don't understand what's going on. But Bloody Bill was a member of Quantrill's Raiders, right? And Bloody Bill was in the movie, right? You've got to, all of this stuff has to fit into perspective, right? And I don't claim to be an expert in it, but I'm starting to see pieces of the puzzle about good versus evil. But let me get back to the point that I got off of. what Robert E. Lee said just before his death about his surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse. General Robert E. Lee told former Texas Governor Fletcher Stockdale that in light of how the Republican Party was treating the people of the South, he never would have surrendered at Appomattox, but would rather have died there with his men in one final battle. Governor, if I had foreseen the use of those people designed to make of their victory, there would have been no surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. No, sir, not by me. Had I foreseen these results of the subjugation of the South, I would have preferred to die at Appomattox with my brave men, with my sword in my right hand. Now that's General Robert E. Lee's own words. So when you say that I'm a crackpot, right, for being mad at Robert E. Lee for not surrendering, he even said it his own self, right? And I'm telling you that it's decisions like that that have far-reaching consequences when the leaders that we lift up to be our leaders, when they compromise with evil. It has far-reaching consequences. And that even if it means your own death, right, that you should not compromise. And just go ahead and fight to the death and die with dignity, right? And Robert E. Lee even agreed with that on his deathbed. So let me read you this sentence, and then this kind of gives you an idea of some of the brutality that they. And it says, in Virginia, from Harper's Ferry to Newmarket, the country was almost a desert. The barns were all burned. A great many of the private dwellings were burned, chimneys standing without houses, and houses standing without roofs. Southern soldiers returning from war from their homesteads destroyed, their farms devastated, and their communities on the brink of starvation. The roads and railroad beds were mostly destroyed, and in North Georgia there was a degree of destitution that would draw pity from a stone. Many Southern women, fearful that their small children would starve, traded sex for food with the hated Federal soldiers who remained in the South as an occupying army. Oh, man. Look, I've heard the arguments all my life that the Civil War was fought to end slavery. I've heard men that I respect a great deal, black men like Pastor James David Manning and others, make that claim that the Civil War was fought to end slavery. After reading this book and understanding a bigger perspective about how tyranny operates and how freedom operates, I'm convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that
it's a diversion.
That the entire Civil War was not fought over slavery. It was fought over states' rights.
Yeah.
And the race baiters today that are using race as a diversion, the same thing happened back then. The same thing. And the lesson learned from Robert E. Lee, that I think this go around, I don't care if they've got the numbers. I don't care if they've got the manufacturing plants. I don't care if they've got what looks like overwhelming firepower. What Robert E. Lee told us on his deathbed is fight to the death until you die, but don't ever surrender to these bastards. You understand what I'm saying? Don't ever surrender to tyranny. Just die with some dignity if that's what it comes to. So I recommend you buy this book or get a hold of it if you can. The Real Lincoln, A New Look at Abraham Lincoln, His Agenda and an Unnecessary War by Thomas DiLorenzo. And it was an eye-opener for me, and I definitely recommend it. And that's my book report for tonight. God bless.